Welcome to the Savage Summer of Dogman special. Hope you liked our new open. I'm still working on it. Going for that found footage sort of look. We've got an extra long show tonight and we're dedicating it all to Kathy Barekman. Let's get started with this all new, crazy story that the person who submitted it named The Savage Summer of the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I saw the Dogman twice when I was in my early 20s, but he left a mark that changed me for good. I had just broken up with my live-in girlfriend, and my grandparents were going overseas on a vacation cruise. Or maybe it was the Bahamas or something. I just remember they were going away on a cruise for the summer, and they asked me to stay and watch their house out in the country. The closest town was Rodell, Wisconsin, but it was equally close to the Augusta State Wildlife Area. There were wild animals in that location, and I thought my little pug Jody would enjoy seeing the wildlife as much as I did. Now, the instructions that my grandparents had left me to get to the only supermarket in the area were long and boring. I looked up maps online and discovered that it was much less distant a walk if I cut through the woods in the backyard. At least in the drawing and the map, it looked like it was less distant. I hadn't really considered that a mile walking alongside highways is still less work than walking a half mile through a dense, overgrown forest that there seemed to be no pre-worn path through. It felt like I was walking on land that no human had ever tread upon before, but I made it to the supermarket. This was back in the days of America, when they not only gave you bags for free, but they were the real plastic kind. Double bagged for you if you wanted it, sometimes even if you didn't ask. That was the greatest country that will ever be, and I miss those days. So I got food and whatnot, and I slung one beautiful American plastic bag over one wrist, and the other one over my other wrist. And I twirled them around so that I didn't even have to really focus on carrying them any longer. Everything about the world was so much better back then. I guess this was around 1992. Nothing that's happened since has been anything but a curse on humanity, if you think about it. Cell phones, social media controlled by the deep state, censorship, police shooting at farmers to take their land away on behalf of billionaires, and perhaps worst of all, the universal designated hitter. That's not to say that the world was perfect back then, because I was about to learn that it often wasn't very nice at all. Midway through my long trudge and climb home, huffing and puffing because both arms were weighted down, I decided to stop and eat one of the evil snacks I had bought in the store. I forget if it was a yo-yo or a doodah or a phone bone or what it was, but it was either made by Hostess or Drake's, or whatever the equivalent of those were back there in Wisconsin in 1992. I opened it up with great anticipation, and all at once, the smell of wet dog hit my nostrils. That was not what I was expecting. I held the taste treat up to my nose and sniffed it, and it smelled of staleness and sugar, just as God intended. Relieved, I scarfed the Neo food down my throat. Then I wrapped those plastic wonders around my wrists again, and I got back to trudging toward my pug and my grandmother's house. Boy, that wet dog smell sure would not go away. It seemed to linger in the air. I stopped to smell my own armpits, but they had their own unique aroma, slightly different than the wet dog one. I started to hear something moving in the bushes behind me, and my heart began beating harder. I walked a little faster where I could walk, and I climbed and squeezed and jumped a little faster where I could do those things. I kept looking back over my shoulder whenever I could, and then the thing that was following me showed itself. Well, it showed its head anyway, peeking out through a bush. It was a dog. A dog! I love dogs. Why had I been so afraid? I looked that dog right in the eye from where it was peeking out, and I said something friendly like, "Hi there, boy." That dog's eyes turned cold, and its lips curled back, displaying some world champion feral carnivore choppers. Then I heard it growl, and I stopped making eye contact at all. This dog was clearly not my friend. Peripherally, I saw the beast move forward, out of the bushes, on all fours, and then stand up on his hind legs in one long, slow, graceful movement. By the time he was done standing, he was taller than any man I'd ever seen. I had shaken hands with football players and one basketball player when I was younger, so I had seen tall humans before. I can't tell you if this creature was 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall, or what, but it was the biggest bipedal thing I'd ever seen. When it was standing up like that, it really looked like a hairy human, and yet that head was canine. It was 197% canine. It looked like nothing but a wolf or a jackal or something, but when it stood up, you felt like you were meeting a new species of human. I booked it out of there. I could hear the beast man following. I didn't look behind, because I already knew he didn't like eye contact, and I already knew he was still following me. I made it to the backyard, and when I got to the door and unlocked it, I finally risked a glance back toward the trees. There it was, standing in the tree line. When it saw me looking, it took one step back into the darkness and I couldn't see it any longer. It knew now where I lived. I didn't like that it knew where I lived because I wasn't sure how intelligent it was or what its intentions were either. I no longer let my pug Jody outside by herself in the back, as I had been doing up till then. All her outside time from that point on was on the end of a leash. So I kept my eye out for the Dogman after that, and although I didn't see it for a while, I was pretty certain it was still around. I thought about it and worried about it so often. It was certainly living in my brain at the very least. One morning, I saw the screen of the back door pushed in from the outside. It was torn in one corner. I knew I hadn't done it. Jody couldn't have done it either, since she was never alone outside any longer. I would have seen it happen if she had done it. It gave me shivers, and I really felt unsafe being in that house. There was this old guy who lived in the next house over. He was always offering to drive me places for free. I got a weird vibe off him, so I had declined him before. Knowing the Dogman was out there, though, I started weighing which was worse, the beast or the weird old guy. So I started accepting his offers to drive me when I needed food. And I even let him hang out inside my grandparents' house on one night, because I had become pretty scared of being alone. An incident happened that I'm not going to get into, and I had to go back to walking for the last third of my time out in that house. As I said, even though I had only seen him that one time, the Dogman was on my mind all of the time. Whenever I had to go to the supermarket, I would see increasingly nauseating sights along the way. Animals torn apart and left in the area I walked on to the side of the highway. They seemed to be left deliberately on the walking path, and I became paranoid that the Dogman was leaving them there as messages for me. He knew I would only walk along the highway now, and he knew I would only walk on bright sunny days, so he was leaving increasingly more disgusting messages for me on my path to and from the store. I mean, he is a canine. He can smell wherever I go, right? Any dog that has my scent can figure out where I've been, so it had to have been that feral Dogman. He was leaving his kills as well as roadkill that he had torn apart in horrifying ways, and he intended each as a little postcard to yours truly. This creature was indeed living inside my head, and it was the worst summer of my life. The night before my grandparents came back, I was up later than usual cleaning up and vacuuming, trying to bring the place back to a semblance of its former glory before they got home. I kept thinking I was hearing a tapping sound. I would turn the vacuum off and listen, but I wouldn't hear it again, and so I'd go back to cleaning. Finally, I heard the tapping and I saw what was doing it. There was the dog-headed man, leaning over and looking in the first floor window at me. It was tapping on the glass with its very long dog nails, trying to get my attention. And yet when it did, then he bared his teeth and growled. Jody saw me standing in the room and walked over, wagging her tail and panting. When the dogman saw her, he started barking more savagely than I'd ever seen any dog do it before. It looked like he was going to push himself right through that window. So I grabbed my little dog, and we both ran upstairs, locking the door behind us and listening to hear any sounds from down there. It was immediately quiet, but I've seen enough horror movies to know that it's always quiet, just before the monster jumps out at you. I listened for a long time, expecting chaos to happen at any second, but eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, Jody had gone to the bathroom on the old rug in the room, and my grandparents were pulling into the driveway. You know, I miss my grandma and my grandpa. They were awesome people. I don't miss their house, though, or the wildlife in that area. I'm lucky that I even survived. The savage summer of the Dogman. Whenever I feel blue and wander off the pathy, I'm always glad to read a word written by our Kathy. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Kathy Barekman, for making this episode possible. Some of these stories in this episode were originally dedicated to Kathy when she was having surgery, and those versions are still online at their original URLs, only they're unlisted now because I'm trying to follow the rules here at YouTube. Kathy still needs our prayers and always will, so please keep on bringing them. She's very special to this channel. Dogman thought I was a real Sasquatch. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was just out of college, I wanted to move to Austin, but I couldn't afford it. I ended up staying in a college town I won't mention in Wisconsin, and I extended my teenage years until I was about 32. That's when I met a woman who forced me to grow up. Don't worry, this all takes place while I was still very immature. In fact, this is the true story of how I almost never got a chance to grow up, because I got literally physically attacked by the Wisconsin werewolf. This is one of those lighthearted fun anecdotes that someone tells you that suddenly takes a left turn and flies off the bridge into the drink. It all started in such a fun way. So, I was friends with these guys who were in a band, and together we all went to see Gwar. This was the old days. It was the original Gwar. They already had an incredible stage show, which included a guy in a giant dinosaur costume coming on stage and being murdered with blood flying everywhere. It was pretty astounding, actually. So the guys in the band got all excited and started talking about how they wanted to make me a Bigfoot costume and have me become part of their stage show. I neglected to mention that I'm 6'5", which was really tall for that scene. I was feeling free that night, and I agreed that if they came up with a cool enough Bigfoot costume, that I would appear in it on stage during their shows. I mean, I have always secretly wanted to be a performer, but I'm very shy as well. This would be the best of both worlds, since I could be on stage, but I would be hidden the entire time behind the Bigfoot mask. So I want to make it clear that we were never intending to use this Bigfoot costume to hoax anyone. It was only for use on stage, where hopefully everyone would understand that it was part of the show and not a real squatch. I don't have the nerve to attempt a real hoax. I have too guilty a conscience. This was all meant in fun and not meant to confuse or trick anyone, so I was cool with it. The band got in touch with this early cosplayer who was an amazing dude. He had studied Hollywood techniques in monster costumes and was creating new ideas of his own to use in cosplay. Again, I'm not going to mention his name, but he has moved on to a different creative endeavor since that time. At any rate, he created for us a costume that was way beyond its era. It would still get a rise out of a crowd at a convention even today, I think, but at that time, it was almost beyond belief, fact, and fiction, if you know what I mean. You could tell almost immediately that it wasn't real for a few reasons. Like it had this grayish-bluish face, but it moved fairly well and I could walk around in it on these 18-inch stilts built into the lower parts of the legs and into the big feet. The effect it created was remarkable, and we went into rehearsals right away. So one night we realized we should take some publicity photos of the band with me in the Sasquatch costume, and we got a local photographer to come help us out. We met by the log church on Route 8, just because it was a landmark we all knew, and then we all piled into the photographer's station wagon and drove west. I don't remember exactly where we were, but we just randomly chose a place where there was some grass off the road and a tree line behind us. They had to walk me like 30 seconds to get back to the tree line, and the grass was high. I was in my Bigfoot costume without the head on, and they were guiding me because it was hard for me to see anything directly beneath, and I couldn't really tell where I was placing those big feet. You have to remember I was nearly 8 feet tall on those stilts, and once I put the giant Bigfoot head mask on, I was literally over 8 feet up in the air. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, and I was hoping to remain upright throughout this photo op. Once they strapped me into the headpiece, which also had a built-in helmet for me in case I actually did fall, I was locked into that costume. I don't know if I even could have gotten out of it by myself if I had tried, since I always had assistance both getting into and out of it. This is how I first heard about method acting and other acting techniques and theories. I had to basically find ways to stay in character until someone helped me to take the Bigfoot mask off. I began to study performance artists and comedians like Andy Kaufman, who was a genius and a huge inspiration. I began to think of myself as a Bigfoot performance artist, and we weren't even out of rehearsals yet. As we took those publicity photos, me threatening the guys, and them pretending to be scared or miming out their attacks on me for the camera, I felt a sense of excitement for the future that I never felt before in my life. When someone tackled me from behind, and I fell face forward into the tall grass, I was actually laughing as I fell. I thought it was one of the guys in the band, and I was having fun with whatever happened. But when I landed, I heard screaming and shouting all around me, even as I found it hard to get my face up out of the dirt. The costume was somewhat inflexible in some areas, and I found myself eating dirt for some time before even being able to tilt my head to one side a bit. There was also someone on my back who was taking the joke way too far. Whoever they were making it hard for me to breathe by standing alternatively on my belly or on my chest. I couldn't shake them, and they were on the verge of causing me to pass out. The shouting continued, and eventually the weight was lifted off me. I found the guys in the band removing my helmet mask and helping me to sit up, while everyone was still shouting and sounding pretty scared. There was a lot of cursing and swearing, and people were picking up rocks off the ground and throwing them. When I looked in the direction the rocks were flying, I saw something that is the reason you're listening to me in the first place. I saw a genuine, real-life cryptid, not a guy in a costume like me. I was looking at something I had no idea about beforehand. Some of the guys called it a werewolf, or the Wisconsin werewolf, but I saw it as some kind of mutant dog monster. I wasn't thinking about wolves, in other words, but I don't know why. I do suppose it was wolf-like, but dogs do descend from wolves. It stood up, but not like a human exactly. It had this bent-over posture and snarling face that seemed to be attempting to scare all the guys at once. This creature felt so certain of itself that it assumed a group of 7 healthy young adult men were no match for it by itself. There were some obvious reasons it might feel that way, to be fair. The creature was taller than me. I mean, The real me, out of my costume. It had to be in the range of 6'9" or 10 to maybe an inch or so over 7 feet. I was sitting on the ground looking up, so that might be off, but it scared me how tall this canine man was. I would say canine man is a really good descriptive name now that I come to think of it. I think that's better in this case than Dogman, because the others saw it as a wolf, and I saw it as a dog. We could all agree that it was canine, though, and it stood on 2 legs. The creature had a head like a cross between an Alaskan husky and a Tyrannosaurus rex. I mean, imagine a husky with giant rows of monster fangs, like a row of fat daggers in a way oversized head. The snout was long, and that extends the Tyrannosaur comparison. The eyes looked cruel, although we were seeing it in a moment of extreme agitation. The ears were up on top of its head, and they were triangular dog ears, like on a husky or a wolf or a German shepherd. The eyes glowed, and they changed colors at one point. I had at first thought they were reflecting light back from somewhere, but when they changed colors, that blew my mind. I mean, I don't think I have ever heard of a mammal or marsupial that had eyes that lit up from within. I know there are sea creatures like that, but not something as big as a man that's covered in fur. This creature sure seemed to have bioluminescent eyes, though. I'm not saying that's definitely what I witnessed, but I am saying it sure looked to be lit from within, at first by white light, then by amber light, and finally by a bright red eye shine when it seemed most angry and upset. I remember in my mind's eye what I saw in front of me as if it had happened yesterday. The creature had bent legs. I mean, canine hind legs used as the only legs, but they were far thicker boned than your typical dog hind legs. They were clearly designed to be its only legs. This was a creature as bipedal as a human, although in a different way, with a different center of gravity, and a different means of balance and locomotion. We humans don't have tails, and so we balance differently than this creature did. We just do. It's hard for me to explain, because I'm a layman and not a doctor or a biologist, but even in my memory, I remember how he crouched differently, stood up differently, and so forth. His various postures were always threatening in each instance. I can honestly say that everything this creature did was frightening. Not artificially, but genuinely and naturally threatening. He felt only loathing toward me and toward my friends, and he didn't want us to exist any longer. The beast communicated that as clearly as if he had typed it out and double-spaced it. Now I wish I had a photo of this Bigfoot costume to show you, because although it was magnificent and breathtaking in its day, the helmet mask itself was not designed to be realistic looking. In fairness to the Dogman, however, from the rear, all you saw was something bipedal, 8 feet tall, and hairy, with a pointed head and big giant feet. From the rear, I probably really did look like an honest-to-God Sasquatch, and it was from behind that the Dogman snuck up and pounced on me. Would he have attacked me if he had seen the mask from the front? Maybe he still would have. But from behind, even Dr. Jeff Meldrum might have been confused for a brief moment. Again, the costume was built to be viewed from the front on stage, not from behind in the woods. But these publicity photos sure seemed like a great idea at the time. So there I was, with my butt on the grass, watching this dog-headed ape man freak the heck out overhead. The photographer was in front of all of us, waving a big fallen tree branch in the direction of the dog wolf's face. He was the only one protecting us at that point, although the band were gathered around me closely. I wanted them to help me up so that we could go back to the station wagon, but they wanted me to stay down until that Dogman left us all alone, which didn't look like it was ever going to happen. The canine man grabbed the branch out of our photographer friend's hand and threw it away. Then he glared at each of us in turn, his nostrils flaring. The guys resumed throwing rocks and pebbles at the thing as it began walking, step by step, toward me. As I said before, its eyes glowed first white, then amber, then bright red, as it seemed to have some negative intentions in mind for me. I think it thought I was a real Bigfoot. From behind us came a warbling sound, but only for a second or two. A police car was clearly parked back there, and decided to briefly cue us in, that it was watching the scene. I turned to look at the vehicle back on the road with the officer seated inside looking back. Then I turned back around to see what the dogman's reaction was going to be to this, and I couldn't even see him any longer. He had run back into the bushes. The guys grabbed me under my armpits and helped me get back on my feet and heading back toward the road. I remember asking the photographer if he got any pictures of the monster, and he seemed surprised at the question. I took that as a no. I think the guy was only concerned with saving my life. I don't think he ever thought of himself in that situation. I have to admit, if I could get a photo of a real cryptid attacking someone, I'd probably snap a couple of shots first, and then help the victim out second. But this photographer was, and probably still is, a better man than I am. If he had taken some photos, I might not have survived the attack. These are the nature of the trade-offs that life sometimes hands you. It wasn't only the photographer that saved my life either. It's a good thing the band felt protective of me. Or, at least protective of their Bigfoot costume. If they hadn't gathered around me when I fell, putting themselves in between me and my attacker, I don't want to think about what might have happened. To me, I mean, not the suit. That got torn up anyway, but if it got any worse, it would have been my blood staining the fur, not the blood of a Sasquatch. As it turned out, we never got to use the Bigfoot costume in even one live performance. Once the band encountered that dogman, only bad luck followed them. Nobody could afford to repair the suit, so it went on the back burner. Then the guy who wrote all the songs got divorced and had to get a day job to pay alimony to his wife that he couldn't afford. The band sort of fell apart quickly after that, as guys either got into other bands or found other things to do with their days. See, Gugwe was able to tour and could therefore afford extravagances like elaborate stage costuming, but these guys, my friends, they hadn't broken out of their own hometown yet. So the Sasquatch thing that they were attempting was really beyond their means. I don't even know who has possession of the costume these days if it still exists, but I'm pretty sure it was never repaired. I also never got to see any of the photos of myself in the costume either. The bad luck seemed to have mostly avoided me, but I moved to the West Coast soon afterward. We all kept in touch for a few years, but when I dropped off of Facebook and Twitter a few years back, I lost touch with them all. They used to joke that I moved to Northern California to be with my own kind, and they always insisted that I was really of partial Sasquatch ancestry. When you're tall, you have to accept that people are going to make these jokes. You just hope they're meant in a warm way, like my old buddies in that band so many years back. I hadn't even thought much about those times for a while, but my son sent me the link to your episode about a Bigfoot and a Dogman and asked me as a joke if that was my story you were telling. I realized then that my story actually fits in with yours because that creature who attacked me, it very well might have been a Dogman. In fact, I think it was. And the fact that it came out of the woods into a clearing filled with adult human males and attacked me anyway indicates that it had a deep hostility toward anything that looked like Bigfoot. Maybe these two species really are mortal enemies. Possibly they are fighting over the same resources and food. Maybe they literally are each attempting to remove the other from the picture. Maybe my old-time story from my youth is actually a precursor to some of these more recent stories that people are sending you. Maybe the war between the species started long ago, but is only becoming noticed by humans more recently. Maybe this is signaling to us that the creatures, both of them, are multiplying, even as wilderness and resources dwindle. That's not going to bode well, as if this is true, they will increasingly be forced to venture further and further into and around human settlements in order to locate the resources they need for survival. After all, I personally experienced the deep loathing that the Dogman has for Bigfoot without even realizing it for decades. I think it's important to note that Dogman thought I was a real Sasquatch. I say Gugwe is a Dogman, not a Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my girlfriend and I had been enjoying the warmer weather by going for long drives in the country here in northern Michigan. When we found secluded or dark locations, we sometimes would take advantage of the situation and get a little romantic. One night about 5 weeks ago by now, we were chilling in a fairly creepy location, doing our thing and paying attention to each other. We got attacked so suddenly and so savagely by something we understand so little about that we're both still traumatized by it, and we haven't been seeing each other as much since. It just isn't fun to drive around in nature any longer. Now we're constantly on edge, paranoid, and jumpy that something is going to leap out at us. Something like the Gugwe. We think that's what leaped onto my car that night. We think it was a Gugwe. We've been searching online through monsters that are supposed to be real, and I have to say that some of the descriptions of the Gugwe match what we saw, but not really all of the descriptions. I'll tell you what happened, give you as many details as possible as to what the creature looked like, and maybe you can help me understand what happened. First of all, I want to point out that my girlfriend thinks it was a Bigfoot that was on drugs or something. I think it was a kind of a Dogman for a few reasons, which I'll get into when they come up in the story. For starters, it was manic in a way that reminded me of the way dogs can get overexcited. It didn't act like an ape in my opinion. It acted like a savage, out-of-control feral canine, looking to destroy things. I think it jumped on our car because it had no smaller animals it could find to terrify and wreck the life of. But let me tell this in order, so I don't get confused. It all started for us when the car bounced and we screamed. We didn't know what was happening, and we had to loosen our embrace on each other and look around. There it was, on the car hood. It was squatting down, looking in the front windshield at us, and it was barely able to get down low enough to see inside. This was a large creature, large as a big man. I don't mean an overweight guy, I mean a super tall, super ripped guy. Imagine Aaron Judge, but on steroids, packed with ridiculous amounts of muscle. Then cover that with dark animal fur, and you're getting into the neighborhood of what we were staring at, as it stared back in at us. There's something that I noticed which my girlfriend did not. Well, a couple of things actually, but I didn't notice the second one till later. What I saw right away was that this creature had very strange ears, which were partially like a dog or cat's ears, but were not placed quite so high on the head. Or maybe they actually were as high on the head, but this creature had a much taller forehead than a canine would generally have. At any rate, the creature was furiously angry at us the entire time, and it had those ears folded backward, tight, against its skull. This is probably why my girlfriend never noticed them. She said the creature had small ape ears, so small in fact, that she didn't even notice them. I can assure both her and you that it did have ears. It had canine ears, and they were tall ones. But it held them back due to its anger and its bad mood, and the tall forehead made them much harder to notice. It did exhibit eye shine, but not all the time. Yes, the eyes did look as though they were lit from within, but as they occasionally went dark as well, I could see that it was a reflection of lights from outside sources that I was seeing. When the eyes glowed, they did so like a cat in the dark that you take a flash picture of. I didn't notice any color in the eye shine, but then again, I wasn't looking for that. You have to remember, my memories of the creature were recorded in my brain when I was terrified and confused, nervous, that my girlfriend and I were about to die in a horrifying way. The creature started jumping up and down on the hood, bouncing us all around inside. I started to climb from the back seat into the front so that I could start the engine and get us out of there. With the car bouncing and my hands sweating and slippery, it took a few tries before I made it back into the front seat, and I got pretty banged up in the process. Not as banged up as I was gonna be if that creature succeeded in getting in at us, though. As I finally maneuvered into the driver's seat, I accidentally beeped the horn, and the creature made a backflip off the hood when I did. My girlfriend shouted at me to beep the horn more, noting that the creature didn't like it. I did as she asked, holding down the horn for one super long mega beep, you know? Well, that creature, and this I think is more evidence that it was a kind of a dogman, that creature reared back and howled to the sky. So it was me beeping and him howling, and it was unclear who was going to be willing to stop first. The answer was me. I stopped beeping when I saw I was no longer scaring him. I was also frightened at the apparent size of his lungs, as it seemed he could howl for an impossibly long time before needing to breathe again. By the way, when I pointed out that the animal male howled to my girlfriend, she said so do Bigfoot. I'm not so sure that's true, but to her, there's no difference between like Bobo on TV doing a Bigfoot call and what we heard that creature do in front of the car. Now, I could not disagree with her more. I think it howled like a canine, and not like a Bigfoot or like Bobo. Since neither of us have an audio recording of the event, however, it's just basically her memory versus mine. It's not an argument either of us is ever going to win. At any rate, I was behind the wheel, and I keyed the ignition. This car is a hand-me-down from my uncle, and it needs to warm up for a while before you begin to drive. So I was gunning the engine and warming it up. Once I drove out of there, I wanted to keep going out of there. This car has a tendency to stall out if the engine is cold, even on a summer night. So I kept it in neutral, and I just pumped gas into it. The engine was screaming, and the Gugwe Dogman seemed to take that personally. He started bellowing back, trying to be louder than the car engine. I honestly don't know if it understood the difference between the car and a living thing. Maybe he thought we were parasites living inside the car. I don't know. It screamed at my vehicle as much as it screamed at me and my girlfriend. Finally, after being shouted at by my girlfriend to drive already, I shifted into reverse and started pulling back out of that scary, dark parking spot in the middle of the woods. The creature's eyes grew wide at our backward movement, and it seemed quite surprised by that turn of events. After it leaped back up onto the hood of the car, I now had a windshield full of hairy monster, and that was going to make it a lot harder to drive. I finished pulling out, then turned, and pulled the car back onto the road. The creature was blocking my view, but I didn't want to risk sticking my head out the window to try and see better. The dogman, or whatever it was, started banging on the roof of the car, making a terrible racket, and I suddenly lost my temper. I looked around, got a fairly decent sense of where the edges of the road were. Then I floored that gas pedal. I drove that car from 0 to 60 as quickly as that old bucket of bolts could manage. My girlfriend was screaming incoherently. Neither of us could even see where we were going, and I was speeding. She had a good reason to scream, trust me. So then I slammed on the brakes, and that monster man went flying, tumbling down the road for quite a ways before rolling to a stop. Now we were free to get out of there. Or we would have been, if the car engine had not conked out when I slammed on the brakes. The engine wheezed and coughed as I tried to start it up again. 1 try, 2 tries, 3, 4, 5. I wasn't getting anywhere. In the distance, I could see that Dogman or whatever it was, standing up and brushing himself off. My girlfriend says that in that moment, we could see that his legs were straight, like a Bigfoot, not bent, like a Dogman. That was not entirely true, though, as this creature was clearly standing on his toes, in the way a canine would. I remember, because those furry legs were walking toward us, as I struggled to restart the car engine. I remember that it was hard for me not to look at them while they approached. Unable to start the engine and running out of time before things got much worse, I did something I have not done for years. I prayed. I prayed to God for that engine to start, unsure if God really still cared much about me at all. Then, I turned the key in the ignition, and I don't know if it was a coincidence or what, but that engine started. I gunned it, roaring the car louder than any cryptid, and from the look in that Dogman ape thing's eyes, it understood that it was about to get run over by Japanese engineering. When I shifted into gear and hit the gas, that Dogman Gugwe monster ran sideways off the road and into the darkness behind us. I had won the battle, but I feel as though I lost the war. My girlfriend and I never go driving in the woods of northern Michigan any longer, especially not after dark. I feel like we've had our world taken away from us by that stupid dog monkey bear thing. We're both on edge most of the time now. I jump when I hear dogs howling outside. Why would I jump at howling if the Gugwe was an ape man and not a dog man? And that, above all else, is I suppose the biggest reason why. I say Gugwe is a dog man, not a Bigfoot. The curse of the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I bet you know the difference between a werewolf curse and a Dogman sighting, but have you ever heard of the curse of the Dogman? Our family was legit cursed by this crazy lady back when I was a kid. I realize that's something that's only supposed to happen in old legends or whatever. But this story happened in 1991. I was a young teenager, and my sister was about 1.5 years older than me. Actually, she still is, come to think of it. My parents had been quarreling with one of our neighbors. She didn't live next door, but down the block from us, yet somehow both my parents kept up this daily IRL argument with this woman. If they weren't arguing on our front lawn, they were arguing on hers. Well, this lady kept claiming that her family knew black magic, and that she was going to have to put a curse on us. This would make my parents laugh, but not me and my sister. We weren't atheists like they were. We didn't think we already knew everything that there was to know. So, one afternoon, not long after I got home from school, the lady was outside with some other woman that I think was her sister or cousin. The stranger lady that we didn't know was saying things with her eyes shut, then making gestures toward our house that looked pretty obscene to me. The police had been there since before I got home, but I really didn't think anything all that bad was going to actually happen, so I was inside watching TV as I remember it. There was a weird banging kind of sound, or I should say there was one loud bang. It was kind of like the sound barrier being broken in that it was very loud and very sudden, but had a unique quality to it as well that I can't really define for you. I had heard a plane breaking the sound barrier, and this was very similar, but not exactly the same as that. The sound seemed to have originated from within the house itself. I didn't know what to do, and I sat there looking around. My sister, for whatever reason, assumed that it had something to do with what was going on out front, so she ran to the front window and looked out. "They're walking away," she told me. "They're going home." I had already forgotten about the woman and the police because that was the kind of kid I was. It took me some time to figure out who my sister was talking about. By the time I was looking over her shoulder at what was happening out front, the neighbor ladies were already gone, and my mother was talking to the police. Not understanding what was happening, I shrugged my shoulders and went back to watching television. I figured it was someone else's problem at that moment, but I was soon to learn that it was the entire family's problem, because we had all in fact been cursed. What does that mean, to be cursed? Well, I can really only answer in terms of how my particular family was cursed. First of all, the land itself on which we lived was cursed. That translated into an active poltergeist-type haunting. Objects would fly without warning across the room. Nobody was ever actually hurt, but sometimes the objects came close enough that we could hear them whizzing by less than an inch away from us. You could get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and have a framed portrait in the upstairs hallway fly off the wall at your face. You knew to always keep your eyes open 24/7, and you learned to react quickly and to duck. When tired, my family became very zen, always prepared for absolutely anything to happen. When awake, we started to become jittery and sort of paranoid. I started to love going to school and dread going home. One of the school guidance counselors thought that my sister and I were experiencing violence in our home. She was right in a way, only it wasn't any of the human beings who were being violent. If that were all that there was to the haunting, that would have been bad enough, but this curse involved us also seeing really frightening lights in the night sky in the back of our property. This was somehow part of our original fight with that crazy neighbor lady. She was disputing how much of our property was actually ours. My sister might remember that in greater detail, but that's about the best I can do. All of the houses on the street were fairly close together, but almost all the land behind all the houses for the entire block belonged to us. At least that was how my parents felt about it. And until or unless we gave up that land, our neighbor said it was going to be cursed. I had been enjoying staying outside on our back porch at night, reading by a small battery-powered lamp I had saved up to buy just to use on that back porch. After we were cursed, though, the lights in the sky would come down and float around in my line of vision, succeeding in distracting me from my book. It always felt as though they were watching me because, well, they were watching me. I don't know what those things were. Flying saucers, UFOs, or maybe some kind of living lights, but I do know that I sensed a deep foreboding and malevolence from them. The way I try to explain it to people is to compare them to a kid that used to bully me at school when I was younger. Every single day I would have to get past him to get on the bus to go home, and every single day he made me give him something as a toll. One time, I had to give him one of my socks. Sometimes he demanded money. Sometimes he made me sing an embarrassing song in front of the other kids, none of whom ever took my side. I complained about this to one of my teachers, who ratted me out to the bully's father, who also taught at the school. I was essentially informed by his dad that I better stop complaining and I better get ready for the price of the tolls to rise. Every day I dreaded that part of the afternoon, being pushed around and laughed at. Well, that same sense of dread, that same feeling that I was about to be ganged up on, that same awareness that tormenting me would be seen as humorous entertainment by my attackers, well, it all flooded back when those creepy lights would come down from the sky as I tried to read my book. I found it really upsetting that I couldn't enjoy reading outside any longer, and it bothered me deeply. Both my mother and my sister became alarmed at my depression and assumed it was a result of the poltergeist, who was wearing all of us out. Eventually, I explained to them about the night lights in the sky that had me feeling intimidated. The two of them brought better lighting and their own books out onto the porch with me that night, and they told me the three of us would all read together, with our backs to the part of the sky that the lights always appeared in. We'd face the house instead and get lost in our reading, hoping that safety would come in numbers. After some time, the hairs on my arms began to rise, and I felt that sensation that I was being watched from behind. I also saw the faint reflection of the lights moving around on the off-white linoleum siding of our cursed home. They were there, behind us. I began to sit up so I could turn around and look at them, but my mother calmly stopped me. "Don't," she said, "just ignore them. Pretend they aren't there, and they won't be there." My older sister was ignoring my mom's advice. I could see that she was already turned around, staring at the lights. I could see the mix of amazement and fear in her eyes, and it made me scared to see her frightened. She told us that she wanted to go next door and get her best friend to look at the lights too, and before my mother could protest, she had already run off. I tried to ignore the lights as my mother suggested. I tried really hard, but my heart was beating so fast, and it felt like something dangerous was approaching from behind me. I felt as though something really bad was going to happen if I didn't get out of there, and it was just impossible to concentrate on my book. I thought I heard leaves or branches moving around, and I thought I heard the sound of someone walking through the foliage past our backyard lawn. "It's nothing," my mother told me under her breath, "probably a deer or a rabbit." At this point, my sister came home, letting us know that the lights were only visible from our property. Once she entered onto the neighbor's property, the lights became invisible. At that moment, we all heard a growling noise behind us from an animal clearly much larger than any deer or rabbit. In truth, it sounded more like a tiger sneaking up from behind. I stood up in panic, and I squinted out into the darkness, unsure of even where to look. My mom and sister were doing the same. We were all standing there and trying to see what was happening in the darkness. I saw the eyes first. Two golden glowing eyes standing about 7 feet up off the dirt and grass at the edge of the back wood line. I remember pointing to them, even before I understood what kind of a head those eyes were inside of. My mother and my sister screamed while I was still looking out through confused eyes. They knew what we were seeing, even if I didn't. I was being pushed inside the house by both of them as the glowing eyes ran from the darkness toward us on two very canine legs. I witnessed what seemed to be a hairy humanoid running toward us, growling and making a noise not unlike the barking of a dog. Its head was not exactly like a dog, but it certainly wasn't at all like anything human. I don't know what to compare it to, really. It had a short nose for a dog, but it was not like any short-nosed dog. I guess I would compare it most closely to a wolf, because its ears were wolf-like. Its fur was black and shaggy, more like I guess a terrier than a wolf. It was wavy and long and shiny black all over. There was white around the neck and chest mixed in, and it also lightened at the tip of the nose, but the creature was generally black. I really only saw it in the very last seconds, as it was almost invisible until it walked into the ambient light coming from the windows of the house and the battery-powered lights we had out on the back porch with us. What I saw in those few seconds ruined my brain for quite some time afterward. My family took it hard when I flipped out. I went from being a kid who got good grades to a kid who would stare out the windows like a zombie. My parents sold the property cheap, and we moved into a much smaller place where the poltergeist activity continued unabated. One night, in the new house, I woke up with my entire bedroom illuminated brilliant white and an object appearing to be a seamless silver disc outside my window. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. We were clearly still cursed, even though we had moved, and no matter what house we bought, that land became cursed along with us. The Dogman seemed to have a special attachment to me. I was the only one who ever saw him again after that first incident, but I would see him every single week. The Dogman would appear outside of my window at night, looking like the reanimated corpse of a prehistoric dog. Maybe that's what he actually was. He would move, but he seemed sort of dead. He would tap on the window until I woke up, and then, in my head, I would hear him talking to me. He always said the same things. I remember looking at him standing there with his weird salt and pepper snout of gritted teeth, and I remember hearing his voice in my head saying, "I know what you're thinking." I would try not to think of anything, because he would name it, no matter what I was thinking about. But he would name it in a hurtful or insulting way. One time when he was there, I thought of our late family dog, and the voice that the Dogman projected into my head mocked the poor pooch for having passed away. This Dogman was a creep. It was a mean old jerk, but it terrified me, and I never had the courage to get out of bed and run away when that heinous, dead-looking upright dog thing was outside my window at night. A while later, when my older sister got admitted to a prestigious college in another state, my parents were scared to let her stay in the school dorms. They didn't want Dogman to suddenly appear on campus. At great expense, they bought my sister a small cottage just off campus and gave it to her to live in while she attended classes. Needless to say, the place was haunted from day one, and her life remained a living hell. That is, until one day when my older sister accidentally discovered the secret to breaking the curse of the Dogman. Fleeing her home in panic one night during a particularly violent poltergeist scene, my sister went to stay with her college boyfriend. It took a few days of her staying there with him before she realized that his place wasn't haunted. She rented a room in his house, and nothing strange happened to her there. Somehow, the curse only applied to property that we owned, only to land that belonged to the family. My sister was renting, and so the curse didn't apply to her any longer. Selling both the homes, my parents rented us a nice place a little closer to town, and we've never, any of us, ever seen any Dogman ever again. We haven't had to duck as a goldfish bowl flew across the room at us in decades, and we don't expect to ever have to deal with it ever again. Who knew that it could be so simple to break the curse of the Dogman? Don't go anywhere, we've still got the Dogman story from our thumbnail to tell you, but first, please join us in thanking our executive producer for this episode, Travis Turner. When you're talking about our Travis, what you're really gonna have is a learner and an earner. That's our EP Travis Turner. This episode would not have been possible without the kind donations of Travis Turner. In return, we sent him links to see our weekly Sunday night secret uncensored Dogman stories, and our over 15 hours of archived scary stories as well. You can see them too. Just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the handy dandy join link under this or any of our videos. And now, for that second Dogman story I promised you. This one takes place in a creepy old abandoned mansion in the middle of the night. The electricity isn't out. The house was never wired in the first place. Grab your best flashlight. Make sure the batteries are working. And let's venture into the darkness to meet Dogman in the abandoned mansion. Dear Scary Stories NYC. There was this time when I was a kid that my uncle got into real estate, and he tried to sell my mom this decrepit old former mansion. My mom had been saying she wanted a fixer-upper, so without telling Dad what she was doing, she threw me in the back seat, and off we drove to see this place with her brother, my uncle. Back then, my dad used to work at nights, and I guess that's why we were driving out to the place under cover of darkness. Mom clearly didn't want Dad to know about any of this until she was certain that he should know. Dad was happy with where we were living because we lived in the neighborhood that he had grown up in, and most of his family was still out there at the time. Some of them still are to this day. Mom, on the other hand, always had a dream of living in a mansion or a castle. Her favorite TV show was Dark Shadows, and I blame that show for her obsession. It might have originated in the romance novels she read, though I don't really know. When we got to this place, from the outside, I was quite impressed. The house was absolutely huge, and in the misty darkness, it looked like the coolest haunted house of all time. Honestly, that night, I thought this was actually the mansion they would show on Dark Shadows in the beginning. Not the one with the columns in front. I mean that big old spooky-looking mansion in the mist and darkness as the theme music plays. Google for Dark Shadows opening credits if you don't know what I mean. It turns out that it couldn't have been that place, though, since I learned from a Dark Shadows fan page that the mansion in the credits actually burned down while the show was still on the air. I don't think that makes my story any less creepy, though, because it really was like visiting the fictional Collinwood. We didn't run into any vampires, but that was the only time in my life that I ever saw anything that might have been an actual, real-life Dogman or werewolf. As I said, from outside in the darkness, the place looked absolutely magnificent and simultaneously terrifying. Once we opened the front door and walked inside, though, both my mother and I were stunned by what greeted our eyeballs. On the one hand, we were expecting the interior to be much smaller. Collinwood on TV had such small rooms and narrow staircases, but this entrance hall we walked into was so huge that our footsteps echoed in it. On the other hand, we were unprepared for how bad the condition of the home was on the inside. My uncle began walking up the grand staircase, wanting to show us upstairs first. My mother refused to set foot on those rickety-looking stairs and forbid me from doing so either. She said we'd have to limit our tour to the main floor for that night, and my uncle reluctantly agreed. This house was old. The lighting fixtures looked like they were for gas lights. They also looked like they wouldn't provide even half the illumination we were getting off our big giant flashlights that we were each carrying. My uncle led us to this room in the back that he was calling a kitchen, but it wasn't like any kind of kitchen I'd ever seen. There was a giant old fireplace built into the wall, tall enough that I could walk into it standing up straight. And in the back of that supposed kitchen, I saw something that looked an awful lot like a bathtub. It was built solidly, right into the floor. It had no legs on the bottom of it. Bathtub or not, it was a permanent, immovable part of the room, and I was instantly filled with curiosity about it. Walking away from my mother and uncle, I skipped and pranced over to shine my light into the tub and see what might be inside it. Well, I shone my light directly into the eyes of a huge, hairy, apparently mammalian beast with a body shape closer to a primitive human than anything else. The face on the creature was not human. nor was it like that of the legendary Bigfoot. It was not ape-like or simian in any way above the shoulders. This hairy ape man somehow seemed to have been born with a positively demonic-looking monster version of a dog face, and this dog face held the largest rows of teeth, each looking as long and sharp as a switchblade. This creature looked like a killing machine, and it smelled like one too. I squealed a high-pitched shout and ran from the werewolf man, who reached out and grabbed my jacket, jerking me back and causing me to drop my flashlight. I wriggled out of that jacket in the darkness faster than I ever had before, and I broke the land speed record getting out of that house. When I reached the car, I turned around to see how far I had outdistanced my mom and uncle, only to discover them already within the vehicle starting the engine. The adults had been just as scared as I was, which was not very reassuring. I remember my mother crying and asking my uncle to read the street signs for her and tell her when she needed to make turnoffs or watch out for traffic. It was horrible seeing her like that. I never knew how vulnerable she could be. She had always seemed so strong and superhuman to me before. I hated that Dogman for bringing my mom to her knees. I was used to being scared I was a dumb kid, but that thing scared my mom, and that was uncalled for. We never, as in never, discussed any of this ever again. We never mentioned it to my father, and we never went to look at houses in the dark ever again either. And neither should you. Take it from me, the last thing in the world that you want to run into is Dogman in the abandoned mansion. 3 of my dad's booger dog, Dogman experiences. Dear Scary Stories NYC, on Father's Day this year, I find myself thinking back on my father and his times. My dad was very old school. He farmed, he hunted, he fixed cars, and he claimed to have any number of experiences with a creature that had to have been a dogman, but which he called a booger dog. This was years and years before I ever heard the term dogman, and I don't know why my father would have made this stuff up. The booger dog, according to my daddy, was distinctly different from the wood booger, which was what we would call a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I saw one of those with him once on a boat trip that we made into the swampland to see my grandfather shortly before he passed on. That was a terrifying day for me as a 13-year-old boy. Daddy told me to lie down in the boat and to pray silently when we first spotted that wood booger on the shoreline. After we got past it in peace, he told me that sometimes those things will throw boulders at your boat to try to sink you if they think you're acting too proud of yourself. You have to be submissive when you run into a wood booger, he told me, although even that is sometimes not enough if they happen to be in a bad mood on that day. The entire ride home, I kept low out of fear, and my daddy laughed at me the whole way. When we got back, he told Mama that her husband and daughter were home. I didn't appreciate that. Daddy expected me to grow up faster than I was able to, while telling me all the time that he was being overprotective. I really think each generation of us is weaker than the previous one, because my daddy always seemed like some kind of superhero compared to me and my generation. When my father would talk to me about the booger dog, he would ask me how scared I was by the wood booger Bigfoot that we had seen that day alongside the river. I would answer that I was as scared as I could imagine ever being. Then Daddy would say each time he ran into a booger dog, he was 10 times as scared as when he encountered the wood booger. When you see a wood booger, you can try and be submissive. You can try to sort of reason with him, Daddy explained. But when you're walking into a booger dog scenario, you just have to focus on survival or escape. There is no reasoning with a booger dog. Daddy lived his life on the outskirts of Texarkana. His younger days were east of there near Garland City in Arkansas. His final 20-25 years when he was semi-retired were spent west of Texarkana in a house near Redwater, Texas. I believe all of these stories date back to his days in a part of Arkansas that's less than a half hour's drive to Fouke. If you don't remember, Fouke is the place they shot that documentary movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. I don't mean any of the sequels or remakes, I'm talking about the original from the early 70s. When I saw that, I was out of college and an adult already, and I tried to take my father to see it too because it was about the wood boogers. Daddy refused to go, saying wood boogers are to be avoided. He liked to tell his stories, but he didn't want to hear anyone else's stories. They would just get him unnerved. It wasn't entertaining for him because he lived in the country, and I think he was afraid those things would reach in through the window, just like they do in that movie. It just hit too close to home for him, I guess. Anyway, here are some of Daddy's booger dog stories told as well as I can remember. There are other stories too, but these are the ones I remember the best. I'm going to try to tell them from his point of view, writing as him. These are not actually in his own words, though, as Daddy never wrote any of this stuff down. I'll be paraphrasing throughout, but it should make sense if you pretend this is him talking. Number 1. The booger dog that chased me down a hill. Way back when I was just married, before I turned 20 years old, I came face to face with my first booger dog. I nearly died of fright, but I survived. That booger dog sure showed me who was boss, though. It happened like this. I was out hunting as usual. It was hot out, in the middle of the summer, when the bugs are extra thick, and the air is even thicker. I saw some varmint's tail coming out from under a bush. It wasn't any tail I was familiar with, and I didn't know what was in there. I could tell it was facing away from me, but that was it. I thought it might be a dog, so I whistled to see if it would react. If it was something wild, I was going to try and bag it for dinner, but if it was someone's dog, obviously I would want to spare its life. So like I said, I whistled, and the tail disappeared. Then the bush got all disturbed like something was going to come on out of there. I held my rifle at the ready and waited to see what was going to happen next. I emptied my head of all fear, but also of all hunger and anticipation. If you let your stomach guide you, then you'll fire on anything. On the other hand, if you let your fear rule you, then you might miss your shot when you get a clear one. So I just watched, and I just waited. But instead of some critter moving left or right, or toward me or away, something rose upward. No lie, something started coming up out of that bush, and I backed off a whole lot really quickly. I was afraid it was going to be some other guy aiming right at my head. So I tore off about 20 or 30 feet away, got myself into a good defensive position behind a thick tree, and I peeked my head out. Well, what I saw made me feel dizzy. I felt like I was seeing something from the bottom of a bottle of bad moonshine. I blinked my eyes, and I pinched myself, but that thing was still there. So what did I see? I'll tell you, it looked like a living nightmare. It looked like God put that thing on this here earth just to be scary. Every way this thing could seem terrifying, it did so in spades. It had evil-looking eyes. It had an evil, prehistoric-looking mouth. It was like a dog, but it stood up like a booger. It had blood in its fur, so you could tell it wasn't groomed right. It seemed ill in the head, and that made it 10 times more scary. He was the last critter in the world that I wanted to pick any kind of fight with, and I wanted to let it know that somehow. I don't know what I was thinking. I wasn't dealing with no wood booger, which is probably part man. This was part dog and part devil. That's what this thing was. I backed away, continuing to look at it, but I pointed my rifle at the ground. The ammo I had in there wasn't going to take that thing down anyway. I had been out hunting small game. So I moved away, thinking that would make it leave me alone. Instead, that booger dog started barking like he lost his mind, and the next thing I knew, I saw him charging out of that bush, running toward me like he was in the Olympics or something. I tore back down that hill to the bottom where I had come into it. I was thinking that once we reached ground level, that booger dog was going to be running even faster. Once we got out of the wooded part back onto the path, I was going to have to do something to slow that thing down. So, when I landed on the dirt, I turned around and I got myself down, taking aim at the woods behind me. When the giant critter would eventually run out, I was going to have to fire on him with what I had loaded, then take off running again. My hope was that I'd be able to slow him down a little bit and enable my getaway in the process. Well, that booger dog never came out of those woods. I don't know how far back he stopped chasing me. It was possible he was right inside that tree line looking out at me from someplace I couldn't see. Or he might have only fake charged me to get me running. Stayed quiet for a long time. But when I started hearing the insects again, I took my chance to get on out of there. Story 2. The booger dog that ruined my hunting stand. I spent the good part of an entire summer fixing up a hunting blind that I was sharing with my buddy Ned. He could use it on even-numbered days, and I had it on odd-numbered days. It was located in a prime spot, and we spent 6 or 7 weeks cutting branches out of the trees around it to improve the sight lines. We cut a few whole trees down, in fact, so it was about the best hunting blind that had ever been created. We could look in any direction, even behind us, and we'd usually be able to see whatever was down on the ground better than it could see us way up there on top of that thing. We had this really sophisticated, we thought, protection down on the bottom in case something like a bear spotted us up there, or a wood booger, or a cat. You know, something that knew how to climb up a tree. We cut some notches on the bottom part of the old tree we built it onto. Then about 20 feet off the ground, we had a barbed wire and metal fence kind of thing set up that could only be opened by one of the 2 keys that Ned and I owned. Past that was a ladder that we'd built right into it, so the rest of the long way up was far easier. Nothing had been able to get past our defenses, and so that hunting blind was as secure as it was useful. We felt like mad scientists, me and Ned. So one late afternoon, I was thinking about climbing on down out of there and going home because it was starting to get dark. I did a double take because I thought I saw a man wearing a gray fur coat heading my way. When I caught sight of him a second time, I saw that this guy's fur was his own fur, and his glowing eyes told me right off that I was dealing with a booger dog. Some of them, when it gets dark, their eyes glow like some kind of demon from hell. I seen one once that had red glowing eyes, but this one had eyes glowing this sort of off-white color, which is more common, at least in my experience. I had only seen, I think, 2 booger dogs in my life up to that point, and both times for less than a second before I had started running. I had a false sense of security up in that blind, because I had never been messed with when I was in it before, so I took the opportunity to outright stare at that dog-headed thing. It looked like a wolf, except it stood up like a man, and must have been 6.5 feet tall. Staring at that thing was a big mistake. Booger dogs have that same sense that we have. They can tell when someone's staring at them. Don't you know that critter looked straight up at me in my tree blind, and his eyes narrowed in hate. Even though I still felt safe up there, I'll tell you a chill went through me. After that thing's dog eyes zoomed in, it let out a high-pitched barking like it had just seen a ghost. The next thing I knew, it had run straight toward me, pushing trees and whatnot out of its way as it made a beeline for my tree stand. That was the first time I feared for my life in that hunting blind, as I didn't know if the thing was going to be strong enough and crazy enough to get through my defenses down below me. I could see clearly that the thing had hands like a giant raccoon, complete with opposable thumbs. Raccoons, as we all know, are excellent climbers, and this booger looked stronger than 4 men put together. Well, the thing tore into the tree trunk at the bottom, and I really couldn't see too well what he was doing at first. I had a good view of everything except what was directly beneath me, to be honest. I had a few weeks earlier set up a mirror in a nearby tree, pointed down to the base for security reasons, but leaves had grown up around it, blocking the view, and I had been too lazy and too overconfident to shimmy up that tree to fix it. I could hear the big beast doing something destructive down there. I just couldn't tell exactly what. I didn't hear any metallic noises, though, so I wasn't feeling like he was getting very far up that bottom level. Even though that thing was packed with muscle and had hands like humans or apes or raccoons, which can all climb very well, I don't think that booger dog had his brains wired in the correct way to climb. This creature may be some kind of a dog that is cursed in some way. Like a werewolf is a cursed man in the stories, I think this booger dog starts off as a dog, or a canine at least. It thinks like a dog so much that the idea of climbing just doesn't occur to it, because that idea doesn't occur to dogs. A cat will claw its way up almost anything, but the dog will remain on the ground barking up at that cat. In the same way, I think that the booger dog doesn't really understand yet all the different ways that his clawed hands could be useful to him. This is why I say that these creatures are less human than wood boogers, and why I am more afraid of them than anything else in nature. They are more destructive than they need to be, and they don't always need a reason to do something terrible. The booger dog is the only thing besides man that I know of that sometimes kills just because it can. Everything else kills for food or for self-preservation, but the booger dog will also kill for sport, or out of anger, or just to amuse itself. So, I was shaking all over, stuck in my hunting blind, listening to that booger dog trying to pull the entire thing down on top of itself. The idiotic thing got fixated on me and just wouldn't let up. Hours went by. I wanted to get out of there and go home, but I couldn't figure a way out. I could have risked unhooking myself from my seat and then tried to climb out on limbs and reach another tree, but even if I made it, that dog-headed thing would just follow me over there and trap me all over again. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there, trying not to have a heart attack from absolute fear. It wasn't until the first rays of light in the morning came that I could hear the insane beast stop doing whatever he was doing and walk away to whatever hell on earth he called home. I waited until he was long gone before lifting my stiff and achy bones on out of there and climbing on down. When I got through my locked metal gate, I saw that the rest of the way down had been torn to shreds by the creature. Not just tree bark, but shreds of the wood itself were all over the ground all around, and the trunk was half the thickness it had been before that booger noticed me up there, looking down on it. He hadn't succeeded in getting me down out of there, but he had seriously destabilized the base of that hunting blind and ruined almost 2 months of work by 2 grown men trying to create the greatest hunting blind in history. So let that be another lesson to you. If you see a booger dog, you better look away fast. Otherwise, he'll feel you looking at him, and he'll take it as a personal offense. Story 3. The booger dog that dug up my yard. It was these next two incidents that convinced me and your mother to pull up roots and move to Texas, as these made it all too personal and too dangerous. This was in the late 60s when you were away at college. That was back when your mother's cat Snookums passed on, God rest her soul. You weren't around, so you probably don't know how sad it made the poor woman. She wouldn't let me get her a new cat for near on a year out of respect for Snookums, and she made me bury her in the garden, where the cat liked to play and sleep. So the next night after the funeral, we heard strange sounds coming from the backyard. When we checked on it through a window, we were horrified to see one of them booger dogs digging up the poor cat's grave. That's another thing I think these are cursed dogs turned into hellish creatures and not just a normal breed of predator. The desire to pull dead things out of graves, that's something a ghoul would do. It just seems unnatural and wrong to me. I made your mother go back to bed and I went out back to make noise and scare that thing off. I put a big stone slab over the grave to keep out the predators. You remember that stone. It was right in the middle of your mother's garden and a constant reminder of her loss. My temper toward the booger dog had reached a boiling point, and the next thing that happened just pushed it all too far for us to put up with it any longer. Your mother was washing the dishes in the kitchen one night when that dog-headed freak came right up to the window and stared right in at her. She screamed and broke some dishes and the thing ran off, but that was the last straw. They had gotten so brazen as to come right up to us, inches away, and just stare into our home like they were the landlord or something. They had decided there were no boundaries between us and them, and it was only a matter of time before there was going to be violence, or maybe something a lot worse than that. This was when we contacted real estate people and put our old place on the market. We were in our new home near Redwater before Christmas. It's only 20 or 25 miles west of Garland City, but it's on the other side of Texarkana, and I just don't think booger dogs are as plentiful over here. At least, we've been mostly left alone since our move. And that ends that story. I do remember one more Dogman story my father used to tell, but that one is pretty violent, and it made my daddy cry to tell it. If you want that story, just let me know. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed my retelling of 3 of my daddy's booger dog, Dogman experiences. Dogman zapped by UFO, aka Dogman followed our daughter home. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my teenage daughter I'll call Z had a Dogman experience I'd like to relate to you on her behalf. She and I had been drifting apart, but her sighting brought us back together as I told her about my own Dogman experience, which was also a UFO experience, back in the 1980s, when I was just a little bit older than she is now. I'll tell you what I can remember about that one also. It was very involved and extremely strange. So although it has been a father-daughter bonding experience, Z wants me to keep her name and our immediate location private. She's going to be a senior in high school this coming fall, and nobody wants to spend senior year being called Dogman Girl, or worse yet, Dog Girl. What I can say is that we live in a suburban area in the middle of Pennsylvania, somewhat east of center, I guess. It's a nice place, and there are beautiful hills surrounding us. I especially love that, being able to see green mountains in 2 directions. Like here we humans are, down in our world. And right there, with the naked eye, you can see that other mountainous world, inhabited by raccoons and bears and cougars, and let's face it, this is Pennsylvania, so you're looking directly at where the Bigfoot and the Dogman and the weird flying creatures are all supposed to come from, at least according to local legend. So my daughter Z called me up one night last week, panicked. She was walking home from her friend's place on the other side of town when she saw a huge dog, like Marmaduke, extra large size, but with more of a wolf-like head, and was walking on the other side of a tall fence surrounding a yard. She said the fence was taller than she was, and the fur on the back of that dog was taller than the top of the fence. Hearing me repeat this information, my wife immediately jumped to the conclusion that our daughter had been drugged, and I have to say it was a possibility that could not yet be ruled out. So, we didn't know if this was actually even happening as we jumped into the car and drove to the street that Z told us she was walking down. So anyway, when she saw the dog, she just acted like she wasn't scared and tried to walk as calmly as possible past that tall fence. The dog paced her down the street. Z felt that the big canine was looking at her, but she just kept looking forward, pretending to ignore the creature. Up next on her left was a tall hedge, just as tall as that fence had been. At first, she felt great relief to not have to see that dog any longer, but then she heard an odd sound above her head. Looking up, there was that wolf head, looking back down at her. Z accidentally made eye contact with the dog, and that huge creature barked loudly at her. She screamed and ran across the street, and that dog continued to bark at her. It also followed her as she walked down the street, its head sticking up over the top of the hedge. Z was imagining that it was balancing itself on that hedge as it walked along, but when they both walked past the hedge property, she saw the great creature leap over the next fence and continue walking bipedally, its head staying up at the same level. This next property was surrounded by a chain-link fence, which that dog did not ever need to lean on. It was walking quite well on its hind legs, and its front legs were back at its sides, more like human arms than like the appendages of a canine. So at that point, my wife started quizzing Z about what she had eaten or drank or smoked or ingested in any way that night. I could see she was fine. I was more interested in understanding if the tall, upright canine was still stalking her. And that was when Z broke down. I could hear her struggling with fear and emotion when she told me that she couldn't even tell anymore if it was still following her or if she was walking alone when we picked her up. While my wife shook her head and tisk-tisked, I took a shortcut and got our daughter into the safety of that car. Immediately, my wife started doing all she could to get Z even more upset in the name of being concerned. I shouted, "Look!" and pointed. This quieted everyone down fast. They wanted to know what I was pointing at, and both of them were looking where my finger indicated that they should. "Oh, too late," I said. "It just ran behind that patch of trees. That thing looked taller than me." I threw the car into gear and peeled out, saying that dog-headed man was heading our way, and we better get home fast. Of course, I hadn't actually seen anything. I just wanted to validate my daughter, who was clearly not drugged or hallucinating. It might not have been the most honest thing to do, but my wife was a lot nicer to our daughter about this whole incident afterward. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I had my own weird Dogman experience when I was much younger. Maybe it's a coming-of-age ritual in our family or something, to see a Dogman. Not to brag, but when it happened to me, I saw a whole bunch of Dogmen. So, not everyone knows this, but Pennsylvania is ranked number 6 of all the United States in terms of UFO sightings. I've known this since I was a kid, however, and was actually trying to track one specific and unique UFO one time, when it led me, directly, into an entire grouping of what had to have been dogmen, or werewolves, right here in the Keystone State of Pennsylvania. Now, I know most of the viewers on this channel are interested in dogmen and not UFOs, but I never would have seen a single one of those dogmen if not for this particular UFO. I ended up seeing an entire family or small clan of them gathered in one location because of following this strange flying vehicle. And that's your reward as well if you stick with me through my retelling of this as it happened to me way back in the far more innocent times of the late 1980s. As we all know, much of the world was different back then, but one thing that was the same, albeit a bit younger, was UFO and cryptid researcher Stan Gordon. I remember listening to him on some local late-night radio show back then. I really don't remember what the name or who the host of the show was. I do remember that Stan told that same story about Kecksburg and the strange UFO that crashed there when he was a teenager, back in the 1960s. I was 20 when I heard that story in 1987, and I thought at the time that if Stan could become an investigator when he was a teenager, I could certainly do it when I was 20. My best friend back then, who I'm going to call Melvin, because he was a big Jerry Lewis fan in those days, had camping equipment that he never used. So I joined up with him, or convinced him to join up with me, and we became a UFO and monster investigation team. We didn't name it. It was the 80s, not the 90s. Basically, this meant we'd go camping together and sit outside, craning our necks back and looking upward for UFOs. We'd also have VHS parties where we'd watch cool documentaries about spooky stuff, narrated by guys like William Shatner and Rod Serling. After a while, we'd actually get 3 or 4 friends to show up to some of our meetings, but usually in terms of the camping, it was just me and Melvin. Still, it was nice at the meetings to have a few people interested in what we had seen while we were out camping. Back then, we didn't have night vision cameras or anything. At first, we only brought an audio cassette recorder in case we heard Bigfoot, which we never did. I got a VHS camcorder for Christmas later that year, or maybe the next one. But when this happened, we had no means of recording images with us, only audio. So while my mom drove us to the campgrounds that night, Melvin and I saw a strange light in the night sky. It was a bunch of lights, actually, although I did not see those flashing lights, which all aircraft legally have to have. I mean, there were lights blinking all around it, but they blinked different colors each time, and if you looked at it for too long, man, you would start to feel lightheaded. Melvin and I decided to count to 4 each time we looked at the strange thing, or a collection of things, or whatever it was, up in the sky, and we'd look away before we counted to 5. This way we could keep track of the location of it fairly well, without getting entranced by it. We figured we were in for an interesting evening, if this was how it was going to start, but we didn't know the half of it. So I remember the location of where my mom left us off, but I forget the name of the place. I'm 90% sure it had to be this campground here, called Dingman's Campground on Google Maps. No, not Dogman's Campground, but pretty close. I don't remember noticing that coincidence back then. So I don't know if that's what the place was called in those days. It's right next to Dingman's Ferry, though, so probably it was. Also, it's right off of US Route 209, which I know you on your channel think is some kind of weird or spooky number. So we had that going for us as well. If it wasn't that campground, then at least I know it was right in that location, just a stone's throw across the Delaware River from New Jersey. While I checked us in, Melvin stayed outside and kept his eye on that UFO. We were lucky enough to camp in the outermost area they had available, and there was nobody else near where we were. We were lit only by the moon and the stars, and it was super dark that night. I remember pitching our tent, then sitting outside at the nearby picnic table, staring up at the night sky, counting to 4 out loud, then letting the other guy take his turn. After a while, that became too much work, and we sort of just sat facing the direction of the lights, gazing up from time to time, noting that they seemed to be floating over the Delaware River. At some point, though, the craft suddenly turned and flew in our direction. The closer it got, the more we could see what it was, or at least what it wanted us to think it was. We seemed to be looking at a solid flying craft, but not a disc-shaped or cigar-shaped one as we had been led to expect. This seemed more like something out of a Star Wars movie, maybe something a little closer to a TIE fighter or whatever those single-person craft were called. You know, the ones they blew up the Death Star with in that first movie. This was sort of flatter, though, and wider, and it had what looked like traditional earthly turrets in the front, which opened up as it drew closer to us. Then, two long cylindrical metallic shafts moved out of those turrets simultaneously, and Melvin and I looked at each other with the shocked expressions of two men who expect to have their lives snuffed out in the next few seconds. Well, we took off running. The only direction we cared about right then was away, as in as far away from that flying gunboat as possible. And the further we ran away, the quieter it got, until suddenly there was an eruption of very unhappy canine sounds from somewhere back closer to the river. That flying thing wasn't coming for us after all, but it sounded as though it were either frightening or possibly harming some dogs behind us. I think maybe it was sympathy for those unseen dogs, or maybe it was that same urge that people have to stare at accidents, but we both ran back to see what was happening to those dogs. As we drew nearer, we could also hear a sound like an electrical discharge, which is a pretty odd thing to hear while out camping in the woods near a river. Finally, we walked between two trees and came out into an area where we could see what was making all that noise. The flying Star Wars craft was firing some kind of intense blue light beams out that joined together into one larger beam. The targets of the skyboat's blasts were these creatures down on the land, who appeared both human and canine at the same time. The effects of the blasts seemed to be in some ways similar to a taser, as the victims shook violently and uncontrollably as they fell, then continued to gyrate and bounce around long after they appeared to have been rendered unconscious. It was sort of not what we were expecting to see, not even in eastern Pennsylvania, over near Weird, New Jersey. So, there was a nest of these half-dog, half-human creatures. That just jogged my memory. I remember at the time, we said it looked like the Island of Lost Souls, or maybe the Island of Dr. Moreau. I know I was thinking of the old black and white version, with Bela Lugosi. Had the Michael Caine version even come out yet by 1987? Either of those works, though, because the creatures looked like science experiments that had escaped. I don't mean that each of them was based on a different kind of animal, as in those movies. These were all wolf people that we were seeing. It was sort of like whoever or whatever created them used dog parts to make a human being. Their legs look like dog legs in the back, but their front arms look like ape or human arms. Their heads looked like a family of wolves, but those wolf heads were on the tops of wide shoulders and broad chests. I wondered at the time if these were natural creatures that the flying craft was either trying to capture or exterminate, or if perhaps they really were experiments who escaped and were being rounded up. I don't know how many there were, but let me think. I saw 2 of them get zapped by the craft, and I saw shots fired into areas that I could not see from my angle, which might have indicated that there were at least 3 more in those locations. I then remember Melvin and me turning and bolting out of there when we felt the ground rumble, and then saw 4 or 5 of the large upright canines running right in our direction. I got my first real sense of how large they were, and I understood why I was feeling the ground bouncing underneath me in direct relation to how close they were getting. This was a moving wall of gargantuas. It was more frightening than an NFL team running at you and looking to make a tackle. These creatures were not only bigger than human athletes by a wide margin, they also seemed to be carrying far more weight. I ran as fast as I could, for longer than I ever thought I could, back away from the lake and into someone else's cabin. The family renting the cabin were outside at their campfire and seemed somewhat unhappy that a total stranger had run into their cabin and closed the door behind him. I looked out their window, expecting to see everything barreled over and down, when those 7 or 8 foot tall upright canines came smashing through the campgrounds. That's not what I saw. I saw the father of that family walk up to the cabin that he had rented and open his door. Then I experienced being grabbed by my shirt, dragged out of said cabin, and tossed gently yet firmly onto the dirty ground. "Thanks for dropping by," said the super witty dad as he returned to his family and their campfire. So where had the Dogman gone? I didn't see them anywhere, and even when I was laying belly down to the ground, I no longer felt them running around anywhere close by. I also didn't know where Melvin had gone either. I had a more immediate issue to deal with, though, so I got up and walked toward the public restrooms. After doing my business and washing my face in a sink, I heard someone whispering my name. Looking around, I saw a still terrified Melvin staring out at me through wide eyes from a stall. He was asking me if the coast was clear, and so I caught him up with what I've already told you. So we went back to our campsite and nothing else interesting happened that night. There were no strange lights in the sky, no strange cryptids on the ground. We couldn't figure out any logical place they could have vanished to either. It made an interesting story at our next meeting, but little more than that. Now, even back in those days, both Melvin and I had a gut feeling that the flying craft we were looking at was not from another world. It just felt like something made on Earth, but I can't say exactly why. It was definitely not a legal aircraft. It had none of the little flashy lights that all flying vehicles are required to have. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was from beyond the stars. This is also not to say that it was using any technology officially known to human science in the late 80s either. So in other words, we both had a theory that is probably even less popular in the mainstream than thinking we were seeing a spacecraft zapping those Dogman would be. He and I think we saw hidden technology. I don't know if we're talking about one lone genius inventor keeping his invention secret, or if we're talking about advanced military weaponry, or if I mean a fully blown breakaway civilization. But we did both really feel strongly that the flying craft was most likely terrestrial. We never saw inside the thing, so we never saw who was flying it, or if it was an advanced drone. The ship flew in a way that we could not explain. It was like a jet when moving forward in a straight line, but it could stop and hover like a helicopter as well. There was one time I saw it fly up and backward, then straight forward, hover, fire, then drop straight down to fire directly forward, from 5 feet off the ground into yet another Dogman. I've never heard of any flying craft that could even do that slowly, but this vehicle was doing it as fast as if it were in a cartoon. Which of course brings us to another theory about what happened that we would be wrong to leave out. And that is that what we both thought we saw might have been some kind of a simulation of some sort. I don't know how Mel and I could both see the exact same thing if it were a hallucination. If it were somehow being broadcast or narrowcast into our nervous systems at the same time, that might actually explain every part of it. It's the only one of the 3 theories so far that includes an explanation for where the Dogman and the UFO went in the end. Why were Mel and I the only 2 campers who saw any of this? Was this some sort of theater created only for me and Mel? It's not any harder to believe that possibility than it is to believe that we saw an aircraft bend the laws of physics, which was sure what some of those maneuvers looked like. At any rate, that's about all I have to say about Dogman, from my family's experiences to my personal pet theories. I'll never forget the time that I saw Dogman zapped by a UFO. Today our EP is CS, long-sightedness, multi-process. Today our EP is CS. She does impress, like 3D chess. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer CS for making this episode possible. CS is both a channel member and has used our new thanks button, which is sort of the same thing as a super chat, but for those of us who don't do live streams. We share various perks with CS, including secret episodes and over 25 hours of archived secret stories. Here to fill you in with more info about that is the star of glasses, mugs, tote bags, and pillows in our merch store, none other than international TV spokesmongrel Henry Lee Dogman. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.